We beg you now to return our mother to us so that we can celebrate with her.
Investigation says that Tommaso Cioni, Annie P. Guthrie's husband, may be the prime suspect in this case, and Annie's vehicle has been towed, impounded, and is now in evidence.
It was here that the US news anchor's mother, Nancy, disappeared in the middle of the night from her home on the outskirts of Tucson in Arizona. Authorities believe she was kidnapped, but they don't know by who. Her blood found on the doorstep, one of the few clues that police are working with.
February 11th, 2026. Nancy Guthrie has been missing for 11 days. Her daughter Savannah is one of the most recognizable journalists in America. The FBI has released footage of a masked suspect. A man has been detained and released. And across social media, across comment sections, across every corner of the internet where people discuss true crime, one name keeps appearing over and over with increasing intensity. Tommaso Cioni, Nancy's son-in-law, the last person to see her alive. And in the court of public opinion, he has already been tried, convicted, and sentenced. But here is what you need to understand before we go any further into this case. Tommaso Cioni has not been charged with any crime. He has not been named as a suspect by law enforcement. He has not been arrested. The speculation surrounding him is exactly that, speculation. And the distance between speculation and fact, between suspicion and evidence, between what the internet believes and what investigators can prove, is not just significant. It is the difference between justice and injustice, between a system that works and a system that destroys innocent people based on nothing more than circumstantial proximity to a tragedy. This is not a video about proving Tommaso Cioni guilty. This is a video about understanding how easily public opinion can convict someone without evidence, how dangerous that process is, and why the presumption of innocence is not just a legal technicality, but a foundational protection that exists for all of us. We are going to examine every piece of publicly available information about Tommaso Cioni's connection to this case. We are going to look at the timeline. We are going to look at what law enforcement has done and has not done. And we are going to talk about why rushing to judgment in a case like this is not just wrong. It is actively harmful to the investigation and to the family. If you are here because you want to understand this case properly, because you want to separate fact from speculation, because you believe that even in the most emotionally charged situations, we have a responsibility to think critically and demand evidence before we destroy someone's reputation, then you are in the right place. Subscribe to True Crime Vault right now and hit that notification bell, because this channel is built on the principle that real cases deserve real analysis, not mob justice. Hit that like button as well. It tells the algorithm that serious, responsible true crime coverage matters. Now let us get into this carefully, thoroughly, and with the respect that both Nancy Guthrie and the truth deserve. Let us start with what we actually know as established, documented, publicly confirmed fact. On January 31st, 2026, at approximately 5:32 in the evening, Nancy Guthrie took an Uber to her daughter Annie's home for dinner. Annie is Nancy's daughter and Savannah Guthrie's sister. Annie is married to Tommaso Cioni. This was a family dinner, an unremarkable Saturday evening. Nancy spent time with her daughter and son-in-law, had a meal, and when the evening concluded, Tommaso drove her home. At 9:48 in the evening, Tommaso Cioni dropped Nancy off at her residence in the Catalina foothills outside Tucson, Arizona. At 9:50, security systems at Nancy's home registered the closing of the garage door. Tommaso reportedly drove away at that time. Nancy Guthrie was home, and that is the last confirmed moment anyone saw Nancy Guthrie alive. These facts are not in dispute. They were part of the official timeline released by the Pima County Sheriff's Department at a press conference on February 5th. Tommaso Cioni was the person who drove Nancy home. He was the last person to see her before she disappeared. This is documented, this is confirmed, and this is where the speculation begins. The human mind, when confronted with a mysterious disappearance, looks for patterns, looks for explanations, looks for someone to hold responsible. And in criminal investigations, there is a statistical reality that law enforcement is deeply aware of. When someone is harmed or goes missing, the perpetrator is statistically more likely to be someone known to the victim than a stranger. Spouses, family members, close associates, these categories of people appear in the data with a frequency that cannot be ignored. Law enforcement knows this. The public knows this. And when the last person to see a missing woman alive is a family member, that statistical pattern activates in people's minds immediately. But here is what that statistical pattern does not do. It does not prove anything about any specific case. Statistics describe populations. They do not determine individual guilt. The fact that family members are statistically more likely to be involved in cases like this does not mean that Tommaso Cioni is involved in this case. It means that law enforcement, doing their job properly, would look carefully at everyone who had recent contact with Nancy, including and especially family members, which is exactly what they did. In the course of the investigation, law enforcement executed a search of the home that Tommaso and Annie Cioni share. This is a fact. It was reported by NBC News and confirmed through multiple sources. A search of their home was conducted as part of the investigation into Nancy's disappearance. And for many people following this case, that search was the moment when suspicion crystallized into something that felt like confirmation. If the police searched his house, they must think he is involved. If they are looking at him that carefully, there must be something there. He must have done something. But that reasoning, as intuitive as it feels, misunderstands what a search warrant is and what it means in the context of an investigation. So let us talk about search warrants, about what they require, and about what they do and do not tell us about a person's guilt or innocence. A search warrant is a legal document issued by a judge that authorizes law enforcement to search a specific location for specific evidence related to a specific crime. To obtain a search warrant, investigators must present probable cause. Probable cause is a legal standard that requires a reasonable belief supported by facts and circumstances that evidence of a crime will be found in the location to be searched. It is more than a hunch. It is more than suspicion, but it is substantially less than the standard required to charge someone with a crime, let alone convict them. The standard for a search warrant is probable cause. The standard for an arrest is also probable cause, but often with additional considerations about flight risk and public safety. The standard for filing criminal charges is typically that prosecutors believe they can prove the case beyond a reasonable doubt. And the standard for conviction is proof beyond a reasonable doubt as determined by a jury. These are ascending levels of certainty, and a search warrant sits at the lowest level of that hierarchy. It means investigators have reason to believe that searching a location might yield evidence. It does not mean they have concluded that the person connected to that location is guilty of anything. In a missing persons case that has been elevated to a criminal investigation, it is standard, expected, and frankly necessary for law enforcement to search the homes of people who had recent contact with the victim. Tommaso Cioni was the last person to see Nancy alive. He drove her home. He was at her property that evening. A thorough investigation requires that his home be searched to look for anything that might be relevant. That might include evidence of Nancy's presence that would help establish a timeline, communications between family members that might shed light on Nancy's state of mind or plans, digital evidence from phones or computers that might be relevant, or anything else that investigators believe could help them understand what happened. The search of the Cioni home tells us that investigators wanted to look there. It tells us that a judge agreed there was sufficient reason to authorize that search. It does not tell us that Tommaso Cioni is a suspect. It does not tell us that evidence of his involvement was found. It does not tell us that investigators believe he is responsible for Nancy's disappearance. It tells us that law enforcement was doing what law enforcement is supposed to do in a case like this, which is investigate thoroughly, follow every lead, and leave no stone unturned. And yet online, the search was treated as confirmation, as proof, as the smoking gun that showed everyone had been right to suspect him all along. Comment sections filled with people saying they knew it, they knew he was involved. The search proved it. Forums dedicated to true crime exploded with threads analyzing every detail of the search, what it meant, what must have been found, why it took investigators this long to finally focus on the obvious suspect. But the search proved nothing except that investigators were being thorough. It proved that they were following standard investigative protocol. It proved that they were taking seriously their responsibility to examine everyone who might have information relevant to the case. Now let us address the other major element of the speculation surrounding Tommaso Cioni. He was the last person to see Nancy alive. He dropped her off at 9:48. The garage door closed at 9:50. He reportedly drove away. And then, in the hours that followed, Nancy disappeared. The timeline that investigators released shows that the first camera at Nancy's home disconnected at 1:47 in the morning. Movement was detected by another camera at 2:12. The pacemaker app disconnected at 2:28. That is a window of time from approximately 1:47 to 2:28 in the morning, during which the critical events of that night appear to have occurred. 41 minutes during which the surveillance systems at Nancy's property went offline sequentially, during which someone or something was detected on the property, and during which the digital connection to Nancy's medical device was severed. Tommaso dropped Nancy off at 9:50 in the evening. That is approximately 4 hours before the first camera went offline. 4 hours during which, as far as any available evidence suggests, Nancy was alone in her home and Tommaso was wherever he went after leaving her residence. 4 hours is a significant gap. It is not a matter of minutes or even an hour. It is a substantial period of time during which the evidence suggests Nancy was at home, alone, and Tommaso was somewhere else. For Tommaso to be involved in what happened to Nancy, one of several things would have to be true. Either he never actually left after dropping her off, which would be directly inconsistent with the reported timeline, inconsistent with the security system data showing the garage door closing at 9:50, and inconsistent with everything we have been told by law enforcement about the sequence of events. Or he left and came back later, returning to Nancy's property sometime around or after 1:47 in the morning, which would require explaining why he came back, how he entered the property, how he knew to come back at that specific time, and how he accomplished what the FBI footage suggests happened without being the masked individual captured on that footage. Or he was working with someone else, coordinating the events of that night, providing information or assistance to another person who actually carried out the physical actions captured on camera, while he maintained distance and established an alibi. Any of these scenarios is theoretically possible. Human behavior in criminal cases can be extraordinarily complex. People do things that seem irrational. People create elaborate plans. People work together in ways that are not immediately obvious. Anything is possible, but possible is not the same as proven. Theoretically consistent with some interpretation of the timeline is not the same as demonstrated by evidence that has been presented in court or even shared publicly by investigators. The FBI released footage on February 11th showing a masked individual approaching Nancy's home in the early hours of February 1st. That individual was wearing gloves, carrying a backpack, and carrying a gun. That footage is the most significant piece of visual evidence in this entire investigation. It is direct, visual documentation of a person at Nancy's property during the critical window when she disappeared. And the question that matters enormously is whether the person in that footage is Tommaso Cioni. Law enforcement has not said that it is. The FBI has not identified the person in the footage publicly. They released the footage to generate tips, to see if members of the public could identify the individual, to put pressure on anyone who might know who that person is. When Carlos Palazuelos was detained for questioning on February 10th, he told reporters that agents said he resembled the person in the security footage. That suggests that investigators were actively exploring whether Palazuelos might be the individual captured on camera. It does not tell us definitively that he is, because the investigation is ongoing and investigators have not made that confirmation public. But it tells us that the investigation was pursuing a lead that pointed towards someone other than Tommaso Cioni. If investigators believed the person in the FBI footage was Tommaso Cioni, if they had evidence that placed him at Nancy's property during the window of time when the cameras were being tampered with and Nancy disappeared, if they had determined through forensic analysis of the footage that the build, the height, the gait, the physical characteristics of the masked individual matched Tommaso, it is extraordinarily difficult to imagine that he would not have been detained for questioning at minimum, that a public statement would not have been made identifying him as a person of interest, that the investigation would not have moved in a much more visible and direct way toward him specifically. The absence of that movement is itself information. It is not proof of innocence. Investigations move at their own pace, and law enforcement does not always share everything they know in real time. But it is a meaningful silence. It is a gap between what the public expects to see if someone is the primary suspect and what has actually happened in this case. And that gap should give pause to anyone who has decided with certainty that Tommaso Cioni is responsible. Now let us talk about what it means to be the last person to see someone alive, because this is a detail that carries enormous weight in the public imagination but that is more complicated than it initially appears. Yes, in criminal investigations, the last person to see a victim alive is always someone investigators look at carefully. But being the last person to see someone does not make you responsible for what happened to them. It makes you the last witness. It makes you someone with potentially critical information about the victim's state of mind, their plans, their behavior in the hours before they disappeared. It makes you someone investigators need to talk to extensively, but it does not make you a perpetrator. Think about the logical structure of what is being implied here. Nancy had dinner with her daughter and son-in-law. Tommaso drove her home, which is a completely normal thing for a family member to do. He dropped her off at her house, and because he was the last person to see her before she disappeared, the public has decided that this makes him the most likely person to be responsible for her disappearance. But what was he supposed to do differently? Should he have refused to drive her home, insisted someone else do it, specifically to avoid being in this position? Should Nancy have taken an Uber home instead, just to ensure that no family member would be the last person to see her? The reasoning that makes being the last person to see someone evidence of guilt is reasoning that would make any act of normal familial kindness or assistance into something suspicious. And that reasoning, followed to its logical conclusion, would make it impossible for anyone to help anyone else without becoming a suspect if something subsequently went wrong. That is not a standard that makes sense. That is not a standard that produces justice. That is a standard that punishes people for being present in someone's life at a moment when tragedy struck. Tommaso Cioni has not made extensive public statements about this case. He has not given interviews. He has not gone on television to defend himself or to proclaim his innocence. And for many people following this case, that silence is itself suspicious. If he is innocent, they ask, why does he not just say so? Why does he not explain what happened that night, where he went after dropping Nancy off, what he knows about her disappearance? The silence is treated as evidence, as proof that he has something to hide. But there are very, very good reasons why someone in Tommaso's position would not speak publicly, and none of those reasons require him to be guilty of anything. If you are even peripherally involved in an active criminal investigation, if law enforcement has searched your home, if your name is being discussed in connection with a serious crime, speaking to the media without the guidance of an attorney is almost never a good idea. Anything you say can be misinterpreted. Anything you say can be taken out of context. Anything you say can be analyzed and reanalyzed by thousands of people online who are looking for inconsistencies, who are looking for reasons to reinforce their existing suspicion, who are approaching everything you say with the assumption that you are guilty and that your words are an attempt to deceive. And beyond that, there is the simple reality that talking to the media can interfere with an active investigation. If you know things that are relevant to the case, investigators need you to tell them first, not the public. If your account of events is something that will eventually need to be testified to in court, you do not want a situation where your public statements can be compared to your later testimony and used to suggest inconsistency or deception. Silence in this context is not evidence of guilt. It is evidence of someone following legal advice, protecting their rights, and allowing the investigative process to proceed without creating additional complications. The presumption of innocence is not a courtesy we extend to people we like or people we think deserve it. It is a foundational principle of the justice system that applies to everyone, regardless of how suspicious the circumstances might appear, regardless of how much the public thinks they know, regardless of how strong the statistical likelihood might seem. It exists because we know from centuries of legal history and from countless examples of cases where initial suspicions prove to be wrong, that appearances can be deceiving. That proximity to a crime does not equal involvement in a crime. That being related to a victim does not make you a perpetrator. And that without a rigorous standard of proof, innocent people will be convicted, will have their lives destroyed, based on nothing more than the fact that they were in the wrong place at the wrong time, or knew the wrong person, or were part of a family when tragedy struck. Tommaso Cioni is entitled to that presumption, not because he is a good person or a bad person, not because we have looked into his character and decided he deserves the benefit of the doubt, but because he is a human being who has not been charged with a crime, who has not been named as a suspect by law enforcement, and who under the legal system that governs this investigation is presumed innocent until proven otherwise. That presumption is not something he has to earn. It is something he is entitled to by virtue of living in a society that claims to value justice over vengeance and evidence over suspicion. Now let us be very clear about something else, because I want to make sure this point is not misunderstood. This is not a video arguing that Tommaso Cioni is definitely innocent. That is not a claim I can make, because I do not have access to the evidence that investigators have. I do not know what was found when his home was searched. I do not know what he told investigators when they questioned him. I do not know what his phone records show, what his financial records show, what his digital footprint looks like in the days and weeks before Nancy's disappearance. Investigators have access to all of that information, and I do not. So I cannot stand here and tell you that I know he is innocent. What I can tell you is that in the absence of charges being filed, in the absence of law enforcement publicly naming him as a suspect, in the absence of evidence being presented that demonstrates his involvement, the responsible, ethical, and legally sound position is to reserve judgment, to wait for facts, to allow the investigation to proceed without the interference of a public that has decided the outcome before all the evidence has been gathered and analyzed and presented in a forum where it can actually be tested. It is entirely possible that as the investigation continues, evidence will emerge that connects Tommaso Cioni to Nancy's disappearance. It is entirely possible that phone records will show communications that are inconsistent with innocence, that forensic analysis will reveal something that places him at a location he claimed not to be, that witnesses will come forward with information that changes the picture entirely. If that happens, if evidence emerges that demonstrates his involvement, then he will be charged. He will face that evidence in court. He will have the opportunity to defend himself through his attorney, and the truth will emerge through the adversarial process that is designed specifically to test evidence and determine guilt or innocence. But until that happens, until evidence sufficient to support criminal charges has been developed and presented, the assumption that he is guilty based on his proximity to the victim and the fact that his home was searched is not justice. It is prejudgment. It is trial by public opinion. And it is exactly the kind of rush to judgment that the presumption of innocence was created to prevent. The danger of what is happening online right now extends beyond the potential unfairness to Tommaso Cioni as an individual. The danger is systemic. It is about what happens to a society when we collectively decide that we do not need evidence to convict people, that we do not need trials, that we do not need the protections that the legal system provides, because we have decided based on our gut feelings and our interpretation of limited public information that we know who is guilty. Think about how that plays out at scale. Think about what happens when the standard for public condemnation becomes not proof beyond a reasonable doubt in a court of law, but suspicion beyond a reasonable doubt in the court of public opinion. When the standard becomes not what can be proven with evidence, but what seems most likely based on statistics and proximity and the feeling that someone is acting suspiciously. When the standard becomes not what 12 jurors unanimously agree has been demonstrated by the prosecution, but what the majority of commenters on a YouTube video or a Reddit thread believe based on incomplete information and their own biases and assumptions. That is not a system that produces justice. That is a system that produces mob rule. And mob rule, historically, has never led anywhere good. It has led to innocent people being destroyed. It has led to actual perpetrators escaping justice because public attention was focused on the wrong person. It has led to investigations being compromised by public pressure to move in a direction that feels satisfying to the crowd, rather than a direction that follows the evidence wherever it actually leads. Let me give you a historical example that might help illustrate why this matters. In 1996, a security guard named Richard Jewell discovered a bomb at the Atlanta Olympics and helped evacuate the area before it exploded, saving numerous lives. In the immediate aftermath, he was treated as a hero. But within days, media reports began suggesting that he fit the profile of someone who might have planted the bomb himself in order to be the hero who discovered it. The FBI investigated him. The media convicted him in the court of public opinion. His life was destroyed by the suspicion, even though he was never charged with any crime. It took years for the truth to emerge. Richard Jewell was innocent. The actual bomber, Eric Rudolph, was eventually identified, charged, and convicted. But by the time that happened, by the time Jewell's name was cleared, the damage to his life and reputation was already done. He had been subjected to intense public scrutiny and condemnation based on suspicion and profile matching and the feeling among investigators and journalists that he seemed like the kind of person who might do this kind of thing. And he was completely innocent. That case has become a touchstone in discussions about the dangers of trial by media, about the importance of presumption of innocence, about what happens when law enforcement leaks information to journalists, and journalists run with stories that destroy people's lives before all the facts are known. And yet here we are, decades later, watching exactly the same dynamic play out in real time in the case of Nancy Guthrie's disappearance. Now, I am not saying that Tommaso Cioni is definitely the next Richard Jewell. I am not saying that the situations are identical or that the outcome will necessarily be the same. What I am saying is that the logical structure of what is happening is the same. A person is close to a crime. That proximity makes them seem suspicious. Law enforcement investigates them as they should. The public learns of that investigation and decides that the investigation itself is proof of guilt. The person's life is subjected to intense public scrutiny and condemnation. And all of this happens before any charges are filed, before any evidence is publicly presented, before the person has had any opportunity to defend themselves in a forum where the rules of evidence actually apply and where their rights are protected. That is the pattern, and it is a pattern that has produced injustice over and over and over again throughout history, which is why the legal protections we have, the presumption of innocence, the requirement of proof beyond a reasonable doubt, the right to face your accusers and challenge the evidence against you, exist in the first place. They exist because we learned, the hard way, what happens when those protections are not in place. Let us also talk about the impact this speculation is having on Annie Cioni, because she is at the center of this tragedy in ways that I think get lost when the focus is entirely on Tommaso. Annie is Nancy's daughter. Her mother has been missing for 11 days. She is living through one of the most traumatic experiences a person can endure, not knowing where her mother is, not knowing if she is alive, not knowing what happened to her. That would be unbearable on its own. But on top of that, Annie is dealing with the fact that her husband, the person who is presumably her closest source of support through this nightmare, is being publicly accused of being responsible for her mother's disappearance. Think about what that does to a person. Your mother disappears. You are desperate for answers, desperate to find her, desperate to bring her home. And the public response is to accuse your husband, to flood social media with speculation about whether the person you are married to is the person who took your mother. How do you process that? How do you continue to function, to participate in the search for your mother, to support your sister who is also going through this, while also defending your husband from accusations that he has done something monstrous? Annie has not spoken publicly about the speculation surrounding Tommaso. She has not addressed the accusations. She has not defended him or condemned him or said anything that would give the public insight into what she believes or knows. And her silence, like Tommaso's, is treated by some as suspicious, as evidence that maybe she knows something, maybe she suspects something, maybe the absence of a vigorous public defense of her husband means that even she has doubts. But Annie's silence could mean 1,000 different things, none of which require her husband to be guilty or her to suspect him. It could mean she is focused entirely on finding her mother and has no energy left for anything else. It could mean she is following legal advice not to make public statements about an ongoing investigation. It could mean she is protecting her privacy and her grief from a public that she has no obligation to perform for. It could mean she is holding her family together in private while everything falls apart around them in public. Her silence does not tell us what she believes about her husband. It tells us that she is a private person dealing with a public tragedy and choosing not to feed the speculation machine with statements that will be analyzed and misinterpreted and used against her or her husband or her sister. The broader cultural context of how we consume true crime is relevant here, because the way cases like this are discussed online has changed dramatically in the past decade, and not entirely for the better. True crime has become entertainment. It has become a genre that people consume for enjoyment, that they discuss in communities built around shared fascination with murder and mystery and the darker aspects of human behavior. And there is nothing inherently wrong with that interest. Trying to understand why people do terrible things, trying to follow investigations and see how evidence gets pieced together, trying to analyze cases and learn from them. Those are all legitimate intellectual and emotional engagements with real events. But somewhere in the evolution of true crime as a cultural phenomenon, something shifted. The line between respectful engagement with real tragedies and entertainment-focused speculation that treats real people as characters in a story became blurred. The line between analyzing evidence and playing detective based on incomplete information became blurred. The line between following a case and participating in the destruction of someone's reputation based on suspicion became blurred. And social media accelerated all of it. The platforms that allow us to share information and discuss cases in real time also create echo chambers where speculation gets treated as fact, where confirmation bias runs rampant, where the most dramatic or accusatory or certain voices get amplified, and where nuance and caution and calls for restraint get drowned out by the rush to solve the case, to identify the villain, to be the one who called it first. When someone posts in a true crime subreddit or a Facebook group or a comment section that they are convinced Tommaso Cioni is guilty, when they lay out their reasoning and their interpretation of the timeline and their analysis of why his behavior seems suspicious, other people read that and nod along. They add their own observations. They build on the theory. They find additional details that seem to support it, and within hours or days, what started as one person's speculation has become the consensus view of hundreds or thousands of people who have now convinced each other that they have solved the case, that they know what happened, that law enforcement just needs to catch up to what the internet has already figured out. But the internet has not figured it out. The internet has created a narrative that feels satisfying, that fits the available information as the internet understands it, that aligns with statistical probabilities and common patterns in criminal cases. But feeling satisfying is not the same as being true. Fitting the available public information is not the same as accounting for the information investigators have that has not been made public. Aligning with statistical patterns is not the same as demonstrating what actually happened in this specific case. The presumption of innocence is not just a legal standard for courtrooms. It is an ethical standard for how we talk about people who have been accused of crimes or who are under suspicion. It is a recognition that accusations can destroy lives, that being investigated by law enforcement carries an enormous social stigma, and that fairness requires us to reserve judgment until evidence has been presented and tested, and a determination has been made through a process that protects the rights of the accused. When we participate in online speculation that treats someone as guilty before that process has occurred, we are not helping. We are not contributing to justice. We are not making it more likely that Nancy Guthrie will be found or that the person responsible for her disappearance will be held accountable. We are engaging in a form of collective judgment that has no accountability, no standards of evidence, no protections for the accused, and no mechanism for correction when we are wrong. And we are wrong sometimes. We are wrong more often than we would like to admit. There are cases where the person everyone was sure was guilty turned out to be innocent. There are cases where the public focus on one suspect allowed the actual perpetrator to evade detection for longer. There are cases where the pressure of public opinion led to premature arrests, to charges being filed before the evidence was solid, to investigations being compromised by the need to be seen to be responding to public demand. None of that serves justice. None of that serves victims. None of that serves the cause of truth. It serves the emotional satisfaction of a public that wants answers immediately, that wants certainty in situations that are inherently uncertain, that wants to feel like they are participating in solving the case, even though what they are actually doing is making the investigation more difficult. Let us also examine the specific ways that cognitive biases are shaping the public perception of Tommaso Cioni, because understanding these biases is essential to understanding why the speculation has taken the form it has. Confirmation bias is the tendency to search for, interpret, and remember information in a way that confirms our pre-existing beliefs. Once someone has formed the hypothesis that Tommaso Cioni is responsible for Nancy's disappearance, confirmation bias kicks in. Every piece of information that seems to support that hypothesis is noticed, emphasized, and remembered. Every piece of information that contradicts it or that points in a different direction is minimized, explained away, or forgotten. So when people read that his home was searched, confirmation bias says that must mean he is a suspect. When they read that he was the last person to see Nancy alive, Confirmation bias says that makes him the most likely perpetrator. When they note that he has not spoken publicly to defend himself, confirmation bias says that silence is evidence of guilt. But those same people are not applying the same level of scrutiny to alternative explanations. They are not asking why, if investigators truly believe Tommaso was responsible, he has not been arrested. They are not considering that the search of his home might be standard procedure rather than an indication of guilt. They are not thinking about the good reasons someone might choose not to speak publicly in this situation. Confirmation bias makes us feel certain about conclusions that are actually built on a very selective reading of the available information, and that certainty is dangerous because it makes us resistant to new information that might complicate or contradict the narrative we have constructed. The availability heuristic is another cognitive bias at play here. The availability heuristic is the tendency to overestimate the likelihood of events that are easy to recall or imagine. In true crime communities, the cases that get discussed most frequently are cases where family members were responsible. The Susan Smith case, the Chris Watts case, the countless other cases where someone killed a family member and then participated in the search or made public pleas or did all the things that Tommaso Cioni has not done, but that people expect guilty family members to do. Because those cases are so prominent in the true crime discourse because they are so easy to recall, people overestimate how often that pattern actually occurs. They assume that because it happened in these famous cases, it must be what is happening here. But the famous cases are famous precisely because they are unusual, because they violated our expectations of how family members behave, because they were shocking. The cases where family members were investigated, cleared, and the actual perpetrator turned out to be someone else do not become famous. They do not get discussed endlessly in true crime forums. They do not shape our intuitions about what is likely, so our sense of what is probable is skewed by the availability of memorable examples that may not actually be representative. Hindsight bias is the tendency, after an event has occurred, to believe that we would have predicted it beforehand. In the context of this case, hindsight bias operates through the assumption that if Tommaso Cioni turns out to be responsible, it will be obvious in retrospect that all the signs were there, that anyone paying attention would have known, that the suspicion people feel now will have been vindicated. But hindsight bias blinds us to the fact that in the moment, before we know the outcome, the situation is much more ambiguous than it appears in retrospect. If Tommaso turns out to be innocent, people will not remember that they were certain of his guilt. They will remember that they had questions, that they were appropriately skeptical, that they never really believed it. Hindsight bias allows us to feel certain now without accountability for being wrong later. All of these cognitive biases work together to create a situation where public opinion can become absolutely convinced of someone's guilt based on information that, analyzed carefully and without bias, does not actually support that conclusion. And once that conviction takes hold in a community, it becomes self-reinforcing. People who express doubt are accused of being naive, of not paying attention, of not understanding how these cases work. The social pressure within true crime communities pushes toward certainty, toward taking a position, toward having a theory and defending it. Nuance and caution and acknowledgement of uncertainty are treated as weakness or as evidence that you do not really understand the case. But uncertainty is not weakness. Uncertainty is the honest acknowledgement that we do not have all the information, that investigations are complex, that things are not always what they seem, that rushing to judgment serves no one and harms people who may be completely innocent. Now let us talk about what this speculation does to the actual investigation, because the impact is not abstract. It is real, it is measurable, and it makes the work of finding Nancy Guthrie harder. When law enforcement is trying to conduct a complex investigation, they need to be able to follow the evidence wherever it leads. They need to be able to pursue multiple theories simultaneously, exploring different possibilities without prematurely committing to one explanation. They need to be able to ask questions, gather information, and analyze evidence without the pressure of a public that has already decided what the answer should be. But when public opinion becomes overwhelmingly focused on one suspect, when social media is flooded with posts about that person's guilt, when journalists are writing articles about the speculation, when the story becomes about why this person has not been arrested yet rather than about the actual progress of the investigation, that creates pressure. It creates pressure on investigators to either confirm what the public believes or explain why they are not making an arrest. It creates pressure to act on a timeline driven by public impatience rather than by the actual development of evidence. It creates pressure to be seen to be doing something, even if what needs to be done is the slow, methodical work that does not generate headlines. And that pressure can lead to mistakes. It can lead to premature arrests made before the evidence is solid, before all the investigative work has been done, before prosecutors are confident they can prove the case beyond a reasonable doubt. It can lead to investigative resources being focused on one suspect at the expense of pursuing other leads. It can lead to tunnel vision, where investigators become so focused on building a case against the person the public has identified as guilty that they miss evidence pointing in a different direction. None of this is hypothetical. There are documented cases where public pressure and media attention led to investigations focusing on the wrong person, allowing the actual perpetrator to evade detection for years. There are cases where premature arrests led to charges that could not be sustained, to cases that fell apart in court, to guilty parties walking free because the investigation was rushed. There are cases where the intense focus on one suspect created such a media circus that getting a fair trial became impossible, leading to mistrials or successful appeals based on the argument that pretrial publicity had poisoned the jury pool. These are real costs. They are not just theoretical concerns about fairness and due process. They are practical problems that undermine the actual work of bringing perpetrators to justice and securing convictions that will stand up through the appeals process. The family has asked for privacy. They have asked for space to grieve, to search for Nancy, to work with investigators without the constant pressure of public speculation. Savannah Guthrie has been remarkably composed in her public statements, but it is not hard to imagine the toll this is taking on her. Her mother is missing. Her sister's husband is being accused of being responsible. Every public appearance she makes is analyzed for signs of what she really believes about Tommaso. Every statement she makes is parsed for hidden meanings. The most traumatic experience of her life is playing out on a stage with millions of people watching, speculating, forming opinions about her family based on incomplete information. What the family needs is for Nancy to be found. What they need is for the investigation to proceed based on evidence rather than on speculation. What they need is for the public to provide any actual information they have to law enforcement and otherwise allow the professionals to do their work. What they do not need is thousands of amateur detectives online declaring with certainty that they know what happened, that they have figured out who is responsible, that law enforcement just needs to listen to them and make the arrests they have been calling for since day one. If members of the public have actual information, if they saw something, if they know something, if they have evidence that would help this investigation, they should contact the Pima County Sheriff's Department or the FBI. There are tip lines. There are investigators whose job is to evaluate information and determine whether it is credible and relevant. That is the appropriate channel for information that might help find Nancy Guthrie. Posting speculation in comment sections does not help. It does not move the investigation forward. It does not make it more likely that Nancy will be found. What it does is create a fog of noise that investigators have to work through, a constant drumbeat of public opinion that creates pressure without adding value. A chorus of voices that have decided the outcome before all the evidence has been gathered. The responsible thing, the ethical thing, the thing that actually serves justice and serves the goal of finding Nancy and holding whoever is responsible accountable, is to wait, to follow the case with interest but with humility about what we do not know, to reserve judgment until law enforcement has developed enough evidence to file charges. To remember that the people at the center of this case are real human beings whose lives are being affected by what we say about them. Tommaso Cioni may ultimately be charged in connection with Nancy's disappearance. The investigation may develop evidence that demonstrates his involvement. If that happens, he will face those charges in court, where he will have the opportunity to mount a defense, where the evidence will be tested, where the rules that protect the rights of the accused will be in effect. And at that point, when charges have been filed and evidence has been presented in a public forum, there will be ample opportunity to discuss what that evidence shows, what it means, and what the appropriate response should be. But we are not at that point. We are at the point where a woman is missing, where an investigation is ongoing, where law enforcement has not named a suspect publicly, and where one person's proximity to the tragedy has made him the focus of intense public suspicion based not on evidence that has been proven but on assumptions, statistics, cognitive biases, and the collective judgment of people who do not have access to the full picture. That is not justice. That is not how we should be engaging with cases like this. That is not the standard we should accept for how people are treated when they have the misfortune of being connected to a crime that captures national attention. Nancy Guthrie deserves better. She deserves an investigation that is focused on finding her and bringing her home, not on responding to public pressure to confirm what the internet has already decided. Tommaso Cioni deserves better. He deserves to have the same presumption of innocence that everyone is entitled to, not to have his life destroyed by speculation before evidence has been presented. Annie Cioni deserves better. She deserves space to grieve for her missing mother without having to defend her husband from accusations made by people who do not know him and do not have access to the facts. And Savannah Guthrie deserves better. She deserves to focus on finding her mother without the constant pressure of a public that wants answers faster than the investigation can responsibly provide them. This case is ongoing. The investigation is active. When there are developments, when charges are filed, when evidence is presented, when the truth emerges through the process that is designed to find it, True Crime Vault will cover those developments with the same commitment to facts, to evidence, and to responsible reporting that we have brought to this video. Subscribe to this channel if you believe that true crime coverage should be grounded in evidence rather than speculation. Hit that notification bell so you are here when there are real developments to discuss. And please share this video with anyone you know who has been participating in the online speculation about Tommaso Cioni, because the message about presumption of innocence, about waiting for evidence, about the dangers of trial by public opinion, needs to reach as many people as possible. Leave your thoughts in the comments, but do so thoughtfully. How do we balance public interest in following a case with the rights of people who have not been charged? What is the line between legitimate analysis and harmful speculation? How should true crime communities think about their responsibility when discussing real, ongoing investigations? These are important questions, and this comments section should be a place where we can discuss them seriously and respectfully. Nancy Guthrie is a real person who has been missing for 11 days. Her family is living through a nightmare. The investigation to find her and bring her home is ongoing, and all of us who are following this case have a responsibility to do so in a way that serves justice, rather than satisfying our desire for immediate answers and easy villains. Stay critical, stay thoughtful, demand evidence, respect due process. Remember that real people are at the center of every case, and stay with True Crime Vault for coverage that takes all of those responsibilities seriously.